The first light of dawn began to seep through the thin morning mist, painting the expanse of Arlington National Cemetery with a soft golden glow. This hallowed ground, the final resting place of countless heroes who had laid down their lives for America, stretched endlessly into the horizon. Row upon row of pristine white headstones stood in solemn silence, each one an enduring testament to courage and sacrifice for a cause far greater than oneself. As the sun rose higher, its rays pierced through the mist, illuminating the sacred landscape with an almost ethereal beauty. The air was thick with reverence, as thousands of people gathered for the memorial ceremony. Among them were veterans dressed in uniforms worn and faded by time. Their faces bore the weight of memory, their eyes reflecting stories of camaraderie, loss, and unwavering duty. Scattered throughout the crowd were mothers clutching framed photographs of sons who had fallen, and wives tightly holding onto the final mementos of husbands who never returned. Tears streamed down their faces, yet there was a quiet dignity in their expressions, a pride that ran as deep as their grief. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion, as if time itself had paused to honor those resting beneath the marble markers. A gentle breeze swept across the cemetery, causing the small flags planted by each grave to ripple softly, like whispers of gratitude carried on the wind. The sound was barely audible, but its presence seemed to amplify the profound silence that enveloped the gathering. Amid the sea of mourners, one figure stood out, a little girl, no older than 7. Her white dress was simple, but its purity mirrored the solemnity of the occasion. Her hair, neatly braided, framed a face that bore an expression far beyond her years. Her bright eyes, brimming with unspoken sadness, seemed to hold the weight of the world. She stood quietly before a single headstone, its surface gleaming in the morning light. The engraved words read, "Captain Robert Williams, beloved father, husband, and patriot, sacrificed for freedom." The girl's small frame seemed dwarfed by the enormity of the moment, yet her presence commanded attention. In her tiny hands, she clutched a bouquet of white daisies. The flowers, though modest, carried an unspoken depth, a silent testament to the love and longing she felt for the man whose grave she now visited. Her hands gripped the bouquet so tightly that her knuckles turned pale, as if the act of holding the flowers was also her way of holding onto the memories of her father, memories she was too young to have fully understood but would never let go of. As she stood there, the world around her seemed to blur. She wasn't aware of the murmurs from the crowd, the occasional footsteps on the gravel paths, or the rustling of leaves overhead. Her entire focus was on the grave before her, a place where love and loss converged in ways too profound for her young mind to fully grasp. The daisies in her hands trembled slightly in the breeze, but her grip remained firm, as though letting them go would mean losing another piece of him. Nearby, several veterans took notice of her. One, an elderly man with silver hair and a chest adorned with medals, removed his cap and held it against his chest. His weathered face softened as he watched the little girl, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and admiration. A young mother, standing a few feet away with her toddler, wiped a tear from her cheek as she observed the girl. Even among the immense crowd, her presence was impossible to ignore. She seemed to embody the collective grief and love of everyone gathered there. The little girl didn't move, her gaze fixed on the name etched in stone. In that moment, it was as if she were speaking to her father, not with words but with the quiet, powerful language of the heart. Though she didn't know the stories of the many heroes surrounding her, her small figure standing alone in the vast cemetery became a symbol of all that had been lost and all that had been given in the name of freedom. President Donald Trump walked with measured steps past the rows of chairs, his presence commanding the respect of everyone gathered. Veterans stood at attention, their weathered faces lined with memories of service and sacrifice. Officials and dignitaries flanked him, while members of his security detail moved with quiet precision. Yet, the crowd's focus was not solely on the pomp of the moment, but on the solemnity that Trump himself carried, an understanding of the heavy cost borne by those who had given everything for their country. As he approached the heart of the ceremony, where families of the fallen had gathered, the stillness deepened. Mothers clutched photographs of their children lost in service. Fathers gripped folded flags as though the weight of their grief could be steadied by the fabric. The quiet rustle of the breeze and the soft flapping of flags above the rows of white headstones were the only sounds that punctuated the silence. Then, something unexpected happened. From amidst the crowd, a small girl stepped forward. She was no more than 7, her petite frame enveloped in a simple white dress that fluttered lightly in the gentle wind. Her steps were deliberate, though her tiny legs moved slowly, each one purposeful, as if carrying the weight of something far beyond her years. The air, already hushed with reverence, seemed to grow even quieter. Conversations ceased, and the faint murmurs of the gathered audience faded away. The little girl's footsteps, so soft, became the only sound. Heads turned toward her, and eyes followed her as she made her way through the crowd. She was a single, fragile figure moving amidst the sea of people, but her presence seemed to fill the entire space. Her steps brought her directly in front of the president, standing mere feet away from him. She lifted her head to meet his gaze. Her eyes, clear and tear-filled, radiated a quiet bravery that was striking for someone so young. It was not the look of defiance, but of determination, the gaze of someone carrying a burden far too heavy for their age, yet somehow standing strong beneath it. In her small hands, she clutched a modest bouquet of white daisies. The flowers, unassuming in their simplicity, seemed to take on a profound significance as she held them tightly, her small fingers trembling slightly. It was as if the daisies were a tether to her father, a connection to the man whose absence left an ache in her heart that she could not yet put into words. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but the clarity of her words rang out like a bell cutting through the stillness. Each syllable was steady, deliberate, as though the weight of her question demanded it. "Mr. President, is America God's chosen land? If so, why did my father have to leave me forever?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. It wasn't merely the inquiry of a child. It was a raw, unfiltered cry from the hearts of thousands of families who had stood in the same place, borne the same loss, and faced the same incomprehensible grief. Her voice, small yet unyielding, carried the collective sorrow of countless lives touched by sacrifice. It echoed through the space, freezing the moment in time. Some in the crowd instinctively lowered their heads, unable to keep their emotions in check. A mother sitting nearby clutched her son tightly, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. A veteran, standing tall and proud just moments earlier, clenched his hand into a fist, his jaw tightening as memories of fallen comrades washed over him. The atmosphere was heavy, not with despair, but with the shared weight of pain and empathy that bound everyone together in that sacred place. The little girl's gaze never wavered. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto the president's with an intensity that belied her age. In those eyes, there was more than just a question. There was a yearning, a deep, desperate need for an answer that could bring solace, even if it couldn't undo the loss. She stood there, fragile but resolute, embodying the kind of courage her father must have carried into battle. President Trump slowed his steps, pausing just a few feet away. His usual confidence, honed over years of public speaking and leadership, seemed to falter momentarily. He hesitated, not because he lacked words, But because the question before him was more than just words, it was a plea that pierced the very heart of the nation, a challenge to the ideals that had been defended at such a great cost. The moment grew almost unbearably still. The president, standing before this small girl, seemed to embody not just the leadership of a nation, but the collective weight of all its grief, pride, and responsibility. The simplicity of her question, paired with the profound sorrow behind it, cast a sacred weight over the gathering, leaving everyone waiting for the response that would follow. Trump paused mid-step, his gaze softening as he met the little girl's tear-filled eyes. Her innocence and unspoken grief seemed to carry the weight of the entire gathering, and for a brief moment, the usually composed and resolute leader hesitated. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to her level, not just physically, but emotionally, as though to meet her where she stood, burdened by a question too profound for her young years. In that instant, he was no longer just the President of the United States. He was a father, a son, a man trying to find the right words to answer a question that reached into the soul of a nation. The crowd stood silent, their collective attention fixed on the intimate moment unfolding before them. The flags fluttering in the breeze seemed to still, as if even they were listening. Trump's deep, steady voice finally broke the silence, resonating with a tone of compassion and strength that carried beyond the little girl to everyone present. "My dear child," he began, his words deliberate and measured. "God did not choose America because we are perfect. He chose America because this is a place where people have faith, where they love, and where they dare to hope, even in the darkest moments. And it is people like your father, those with brave and selfless hearts, who have made this land a symbol of freedom and compassion." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Trump paused, allowing the weight of his statement to settle, not just with the little girl, but with the crowd that surrounded them. There was a raw sincerity in his voice, a genuine connection that was rare in moments like these. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her small shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both reassurance and respect. His voice softened as he continued, but the conviction in his tone remained unwavering. "My dear," he said, shifting seamlessly into a more personal tone, "your question is profound, and it's not just your question. It's the question of millions throughout history. Is America God's chosen land? The answer lies in what we do every single day. God doesn't just choose a piece of land or a nation because it's special. He chooses people, those willing to stand up, fight for justice, protect what's right, and sacrifice for others. So, America isn't chosen because we are wealthy, strong, or inherently great. America is chosen because we have a responsibility to make this land worthy of God's grace. Your father, and others like him, gave their lives to uphold that ideal. Their sacrifice is a reminder that God isn't far away. He is present in every act of love, every sacrifice, and every effort to do good for others. God has given us the opportunity, but it's up to all of us to turn that opportunity into reality. So, the answer is yes, America can be God's chosen land if we live true to the faith, love, and hope that He has placed in us. Trump's gaze didn't waver as he continued, his voice growing even more earnest. Your father fulfilled that mission. He didn't just protect this nation. He left behind a legacy in you, a legacy of love, courage, and responsibility that you will carry for the rest of your life. His sacrifice was not in vain. Every time you live with gratitude, every time you help someone else, you are continuing the noble mission He gave His life for. He knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to the little girl. His voice softened even further as he added, "Your father is part of this miracle. His sacrifice wasn't meaningless. It's a guiding light for all of us to know that faith and hope can triumph even in the hardest moments." The girl blinked, her tears still glistening, but her trembling seemed to lessen under the weight of his words. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that Trump's words were a call to action. The legacy of those who had sacrificed their lives wasn't something to mourn in stillness. It was something to honor through living. Each person there felt the weight of that responsibility. And in that moment, Arlington became more than a resting place for the fallen. It became a beacon of hope, lit by the sacrifices of the past and carried forward by the hearts of the living. Trump's hand lingered on the girl's shoulder for a moment longer before he stood back up, his towering frame a stark contrast to her small figure. Yet, in that moment, they seemed equal, two people bound by a shared understanding of sacrifice and love, both carrying pieces of a legacy too vast to measure. Trump's words resonated across the gathering, powerful yet gentle, like the quiet ripple of a profound faith sweeping through the air. Arlington National Cemetery, already enveloped in an atmosphere of solemnity, seemed to freeze in time. His voice, deliberate and steady, carried not just words but meaning, burning like an unseen flame that quietly illuminated the hearts of everyone present. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was alive, pulsing with the weight of the sacrifices that had brought them all there. Nearby, an elderly veteran stood tall, his face weathered by years of service and memories that time could never erase. His gaze drifted into the distance, as though he were seeing faces and moments long past, comrades who had fought beside him, some of whom now rested in the very ground beneath his feet. Slowly, he raised his hand in a salute, the movement deliberate, his fingers trembling slightly but his resolve unwavering. That simple gesture carried more than respect. It was a silent vow, an unspoken promise that the sacrifices of the fallen would never be forgotten. Further away, a young woman sat quietly with her child nestled in her arms. She cradled the toddler gently, her fingers brushing against the child's soft curls, her eyes fixed on the grave of her husband. He had given his life while their child was still too young to speak the word father. Her tears fell silently, tracing paths down her cheeks, but there was no anger in her grief. Her gaze, though tinged with sorrow, carried something deeper, an indescribable pride and a quiet peace that seemed to emanate from within. She wasn't alone. Her husband's sacrifice, though immeasurable, had forged a connection between her and everyone standing there that day. Trump stood still for a moment, his presence both commanding and human. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as though drawing strength from the very air around him. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, warm, and full of conviction, filling the solemn air like a prayer meant for every soul present. God chose America not so we could merely receive his blessings, but so we could become bearers of his light, the light of love, hope, and compassion. People like your father, and so many others who rest here, are the clearest proof that love and sacrifice have the power to guide us, even in the darkest of times. His words hung in the air, wrapping around the crowd like a gentle embrace. He allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of his message settle, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Veterans stood stoically, their weathered hands resting at their sides or clasped tightly together, their expressions reflecting a lifetime of experiences that had brought them to this very moment. Mothers, fathers, and children bowed their heads, their faces a mix of grief and gratitude, as if they were absorbing his words into their very souls. Among the gathered crowd, the little girl stood still, her tiny hands still clutching the bouquet of white daisies. Though her tears had slowed, her gaze remained fixed on the president. It was as if she understood, in her own way, that his words were not just for her, but for everyone there, for every family who had lost, for every soldier who had fought. and for every citizen who would carry the legacy forward. Trump's eyes softened as he met the gazes of those around him, veterans who had given so much, families who had lost even more, and ordinary citizens who came to pay their respects. His message transcended the moment. It wasn't just for the ceremony, but for the nation as a whole. It was a reminder that the values of freedom, hope, and kindness are not abstract ideals, but living responsibilities, duties that every person must embrace and spread. In that moment, Arlington Cemetery transformed. It was no longer just a resting place for the fallen. It became a living symbol, a profound reminder that love and sacrifice are eternal beacons of light. These beacons do not fade with time, but continue to illuminate the path forward for a nation built on their foundation. The silence, though heavy, was not oppressive. It was sacred, carrying with it the echoes of those who had come before and the promises of those who stood there now, ready to carry their torch into the future. Trump moved deliberately, his actions slow and deliberate, as if each movement carried the weight of the moment. He bent down gently, his hands steady as he took the bouquet of flowers he had been holding. The sacred silence that had enveloped Arlington Cemetery seemed to deepen. The only sound the faint rustling of leaves and the distant flutter of small flags marking the graves of countless heroes. With quiet reverence, Trump placed the bouquet beside the little girl's white daisies on the grave. The simple gesture, unadorned by ceremony or words, resonated deeply. It spoke volumes, carrying the full measure of respect and the profound gratitude of a leader acknowledging the immeasurable sacrifice honored before him. Rising slowly, Trump straightened his posture, his tall frame standing firm yet subdued against the backdrop of the solemn scene. He placed his hand over his heart, his eyes closing as he entered a moment of silent prayer. The strength of his stance seemed to merge seamlessly with the stillness of the cemetery, a stillness that was almost alive with meaning. The flags fluttered gently in the breeze, their quiet movement like whispers of approval from the spirits of the fallen, who seemed to bear witness to the unfolding moment. When Trump opened his eyes, they carried a depth that transcended his role as a politician. The sharp gaze often seen in public addresses was gone, replaced by something raw, deeply human. His expression was that of a son who understood loss, a father who could grasp the weight of sacrifice, and a man who could see and feel the immense pride and pain the little girl bore. In his eyes was a heartfelt sincerity that no speech could replicate, a silent understanding of the grief shared by so many families across the nation. The little girl stood quietly, her small figure still and composed. Tears streamed down her cheeks in glistening trails, but her lips curved into a faint, almost hesitant smile. Her shoulders, once heavy with the invisible burden of her loss, seemed lighter now, though the weight of her pain hadn't disappeared. It had been eased. Trump's words and his quiet actions, like a soothing wind, had lifted part of that load. What remained in its place was something warmer, a quiet, steady peace that began to fill the emptiness her father's absence had left behind. Her smile wasn't one of forgetting or moving on. It was one of understanding. In that moment, she knew her father wasn't truly gone. He wasn't just a distant memory confined to her heart. He was alive in the legacy of his sacrifice. He lived on in the ideals he had defended and in the profound meaning of what he had given to his country. Her father, and every person who rested there, had contributed to making America a land of hope and freedom. It was a legacy she now felt not just connected to, but responsible for carrying forward. A few feet away, an elderly soldier stood at attention. His uniform was worn, and his hands trembled slightly as he raised one in a slow, deliberate salute. His face was stoic, but his eyes brimmed with emotion. It was a gesture rich with history, a tribute to a fallen comrade and an acknowledgement of the sacrifice that bound them together. Slowly, others followed. Veterans scattered across the cemetery lifted their hands in unison, each saluting in their own way. It wasn't coordinated or rehearsed, it was instinctive, a collective act of gratitude and respect that spoke louder than any words. The salutes, quiet and solemn, formed a wave of reverence that rippled through the crowd. Trump bowed his head once more, his shoulders slightly hunched as though sharing the weight of the moment with the little girl and everyone present. Then, lifting his gaze, he looked directly at her, his expression soft yet firm. His voice, gentle but resolute, carried the gravity of the moment. "You will never have to carry this pain alone. We are all grateful for your father, and we will never forget him. He will forever live in our hearts and in every good thing we do to honor the meaning of his sacrifice." The little girl nodded slowly, her hands still clutching the bouquet tightly, as though holding on to it was holding on to him. In that moment, it wasn't just the president or the crowd bearing witness. It was all of Arlington Cemetery. The vast expanse of white headstones, the softly waving flags, and the silent stories of those who had given everything seemed to converge into a single moment of unity. This was no longer just an interaction between a leader and a grieving child. It had become something far greater, a symbol of love, sacrifice, and belief in the enduring strength of what is good in humanity. The moment transcended words, becoming a beacon of unity and hope for all who stood there and for a nation beyond humanity can achieve. Trump slowly rose to his feet, the weight of the moment visible in the way he carried himself. His shoulders straightened with deliberate purpose, but his eyes reflected something deeper: contemplation, respect, and a profound understanding of the responsibility that rested on his shoulders. He didn't rush. Instead, he allowed the silence to linger, his gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd. His eyes moved over elderly veterans standing with stoic pride, their uniforms adorned with medals that spoke of battles fought and sacrifices made. He saw the families clutching photographs of loved ones, their faces etched with both sorrow and quiet pride. He saw children like the little girl who had just asked her heartfelt question, children too young to fully understand the weight of sacrifice, yet carrying its legacy in their hearts. In that moment, Trump was not just a leader. He was an American, one deeply connected to the legacy of those who had given everything for the ideals of freedom and justice. His presence felt less like that of a politician and more like that of a representative, a bridge between the past, present, and future of a nation built on the foundations of sacrifice and unity. The silence was broken by his voice, steady and warm, yet carrying a conviction that seemed to ripple through the air. It wasn't just a speech, it was a call from the heart, a promise spoken aloud. Today, we are not just here to remember those who have fallen. We are here to make a commitment that their sacrifices will never be in vain. We will live by the values they fought to protect: freedom, justice, and compassion. Values that cannot be bought with wealth but are preserved through the heart and through sacrifice. He paused briefly, his gaze holding steady as it swept once more across the sea of faces. The weight of his words settled over the crowd like a blanket, warm but heavy with purpose. His tone grew stronger as he continued, the conviction in his voice unshakable. America is God's chosen land, not because we are perfect, but because we have been entrusted with a profound responsibility to spread love, hope, and light to every corner of the world. We were chosen not to take, but to give, not to rest, but to serve, not to claim greatness, but to build it with kindness and unshakable resolve. Trump's words didn't just linger in the air. They pierced deeply into the hearts of everyone present. Each syllable carried the weight of a promise not only to those who stood before him, but to those who lay in eternal rest beneath the white headstones. His voice, though measured, felt as though it was speaking directly to the fallen, assuring them that the nation they defended would remain steadfast, not just in its strength, but in its love and unity. A ripple of emotion swept through the crowd. The veterans, many of whom had spent their lives serving the ideals of freedom and justice, stood a little taller. One by one, they raised their hands in solemn salutes, their expressions a mixture of pride and deep gratitude. Tears glistened in the eyes of some, but they didn't fall, not out of weakness, but out of the overwhelming sense of honor that filled the space. Nearby, a mother wiped her tears with trembling hands, her expression no longer weighed down entirely by sorrow. Instead, there was a glow of quiet strength on her face, a determination to carry forward the legacy of her husband who had given everything for the country. Her child clung to her, too young to fully understand the moment, but somehow sensing its significance. As the applause began, it was soft at first, a gentle murmur of agreement rippling through the crowd, but it grew steadily, like the rising tide of an unstoppable wave. The sound swelled, becoming a powerful surge of affirmation and unity. It was more than applause. It was a collective vow to honor the words Trump had spoken, to live by the values he had so clearly defined. Trump bowed his head once more, his stance firm yet humble, as though sharing a silent prayer with the crowd and those who rested beneath the earth. When he lifted his gaze again, his eyes were steady, filled with unwavering faith and conviction. His voice carried the strength of a promise made not just to the living but to the fallen. We are a nation built on love, sacrifice, and faith in God. Let us live in a way that honors the legacy of those who rest here. Let the world look to us and see that the light of hope will never be extinguished. The words echoed across the cemetery, carried by the wind as though they were meant not just for the crowd gathered there, but for every corner of the nation. The applause thundered in response, reverberating off the rows of headstones and rising into the open sky. It wasn't just noise, it was a promise, an unspoken commitment that each person carried with them as they stood together, bound by the shared responsibility to preserve the legacy of love, freedom, and compassion. In that moment, Arlington Cemetery became more than a resting place. It became a living symbol, a beacon of unity, hope, and the unyielding spirit of a nation that draws its strength not from perfection, but from the courage and love of its people. The crowd stood there, not just in remembrance, but with a renewed sense of purpose, each person silently vowing to carry forward the torch of freedom and compassion for generations to come. The memorial ceremony drew to a close as the evening sun cast its golden rays over Arlington Cemetery, bathing the rows of white headstones in a warm, radiant light. The soft glow felt like the light of hope itself. The little girl turned away, her small steps slow but steady, carrying her forward with a newfound strength, a strength born of faith and pride. In her heart, the image of her father was no longer an empty void of grief, but a steady flame burning quietly within her. That flame warmed her, reminding her that her father had never truly left. He lived on in the profound meaning of his sacrifice and in the responsibility she now carried with her. Arlington Cemetery stood in solemn silence, yet it spoke volumes. The rows of white headstones stretched endlessly like a silent poem, reminding everyone that freedom is neither given nor guaranteed. It is the result of love, resilience, and sacrifices too immense to measure. Each headstone held a story. Each name etched in stone bore witness to the values America holds dear, protected with blood, tears, and unyielding courage. Amid all of this, the little girl's innocent question and Trump's heartfelt response had become a timeless message, one that resonated not just at Arlington, but in the hearts of all who had witnessed it. America is God's chosen land, not because we are perfect, but because we believe in sacrifice, compassion, and everlasting love. And through the bravery of its people, we continue to keep that faith shining brightly. The little girl walked away, leaving behind more than just the scene of the ceremony. She left a story of love, sacrifice, and a hope that will never fade. Her question and Trump's answer were not just fleeting moments of a single day, but a torch that will continue to illuminate the soul of a nation. The story at Arlington Cemetery is not merely a memorial ceremony. It is a sacred reminder of the core values upon which America was built: love, hope, and compassion. The little girl's innocent question touched the hearts of all present, not only because of its sorrow, but because it illuminated a profound truth. Sacrifice is an inseparable part of freedom. Freedom is never guaranteed. It is cultivated through love, safeguarded by sacrifice, and sustained by faith in the higher values that each of us must uphold. America is God's chosen land, not because of its perfection, but because of its ability to spread the light of love and compassion to the world. The fallen heroes did not just defend this land. They left behind a legacy that reminds us the happiness and freedom we enjoy today were forged through their ultimate sacrifices. Each of us bears a responsibility to honor that legacy, to carry forward the values they died protecting, and to ensure the flame of freedom continues to burn brightly for future generations. As the little girl walked away, carrying both her grief and her newfound pride, she represented not just the loss of one, but the responsibility of all. This moment reminds us that we are not just beneficiaries of the blessings born of sacrifice, but duty-bound to live lives worthy of that legacy. Through love, unity, and unyielding determination, we must continue to make the ideals of freedom, justice, and hope shine brightly in the hearts of all Americans.